The palace walls were never silent, not even in the stillness of early dawn. Behind painted screens and gold-gilded doors, whispers moved faster than wind, and betrayal had a rhythm like breath. In the newly forged empire of Han, where every throne was still slick with the blood of its last occupant, silence was not absence. It was armor. And no one understood that better than the woman history nearly forgot. Boji had no statues. Her name rarely appeared in scrolls of triumph or tales of war. She never led an army, signed an edict, or claimed divine dreams. And yet, when the House of Han stood on the brink of extinction, its line fractured, its heirs hunted, she survived. Not because she fought, but because she disappeared. She entered the imperial world not as a queen, but as an afterthought. One of many consorts assigned as if by logistics rather than fate, she was sent from a dissolved court, sovereign king of Wei's remnant household, into the reluctant embrace of Liu Bang, the man who had clawed his way from peasant rebel to emperor. He was already war-hardened, scarred, and deeply in love with another. Lady Bo was young, unpolished, and ordinary. When her son, Liu Heng, was born, even the court scribes seemed to yawn. But Bo Ji had no illusions. She had watched courts burn, watched women vanish without a trace. She had learned that favor was poison and that beauty was bait. While other concubines fought to be seen, she cultivated obscurity like a rare flower. She knew survival in the imperial court was not about power, it was about the art of becoming harmless. When Liu Bang died, the empire did not mourn, it braced, for death in Han meant succession, and succession meant blood. Empress Lü Zhi, widowed to the founder, did not wait for the silk of mourning to fray. She seized the reins of the empire and began a reign so coldly methodical that even cruelty seemed calculated. Lady Bo had seen it coming. Years of observing Lü Zhi had taught her that ambition was not loud, it was surgical. One by one, the other consorts vanished, exiled, executed, or absorbed into obscurity. Their sons were strangled in their cradles, dispatched to remote provinces, or declared illegitimate. The empress called it consolidation. The court called it necessary. Lady Bo called it prophecy. When the messengers came, Bo Ji did not protest. She knelt, bowed, and received her fate with folded hands. Her son, the child she had taught to speak softly and observe constantly, was to be made Prince of Dai, a northern wasteland battered by the Xiongnu winds. It was meant to be exile. It was meant to erase him from the game. She accepted it as salvation. The journey north took weeks. They traveled without imperial fanfare. No drums, no banners, only dust, silence, and the constant rhythm of hoofbeats. The boy Liu Heng was quiet, not because he was stoic, but because he had learned from his mother that silence was a question others would always try to answer. In Dai, there were no golden halls, no scholars quoting the classics in whispers, no courtiers spinning alliances. There was hunger. There were soldiers with frostbitten fingers, merchants cheating over moldy grain, and barbarians testing the strength of every wall. And in that harshness, Liu Heng learned what the capital never taught: how to govern people who owed you nothing and expected less. Boji kept her court small, her servants fewer. She refused elaborate robes, rare silks, or opulent temples. Her son grew up watching her account for every coin, instruct her staff with calmness, and read the faces of visiting envoys with the precision of a master general. And through it all, she reminded him over and over that survival was not victory, it was preparation. In Chang'an, Empress Lü had grown bolder. With the emperor's death, she installed her own sons and grandsons, illegitimate but convenient, on the throne. She declared herself Empress Dowager and acted as emperor in all but name. Her enemies evaporated. Her allies multiplied like vultures. By the time she died, the court was no longer Han, it was Lü. But power gained through force is brittle, and when she died, the empire exhaled. The vacuum she left behind pulled in every suppressed grudge and hidden ambition. Generals, princes, ministers, all moved at once. The Lü clan was hunted. Blood soaked the same stones on which she had once crowned her puppet emperors. And in the chaos, one name rose, unexpected, distant, and untainted. Liu Heng, he was perfect. Far from the capital, untouched by Lu intrigue, obedient, filial, uncontroversial. The court thought him naive. The ministers thought him malleable. But Bo Ji knew better. She had raised a survivor. When the summons came, Liu Heng hesitated. Bo Ji did not. She instructed the household to pack, but only what was necessary. She reminded her son that the capital was not a reward. It was a test. And when they arrived in Chang'an, she walked 3 steps behind him, not out of deference but out of strategy. He was crowned Emperor Wen of Han in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, with banners that read peace and proclamations that promised virtue. The people cheered. The court applauded. Boji said nothing. Behind the silks and seals, the power struggles had only evolved. Old Lu loyalists still haunted the ministries, while new opportunists tried to carve power from the void. Ministers debated how to govern. Generals whispered of revenge campaigns. Advisors offered tribute, advice, and veiled manipulation. Emperor Wen listened to them all. Then he turned inward, toward the compass planted by years of his mother's shadowed instruction. He reduced taxes, commuted death sentences, and refused to launch wars for glory. He abolished cruel punishments. He built no palaces, ordered no grand tombs, and wore robes just plain enough to offend the ambitious. The court was baffled. Boji was not. In the newly adorned palace, Boji was given the title of Empress Dowager. She was offered jewels, estates, and the services of thousands. She accepted only a few. Her chambers were modest, her attendants few. She appeared only when necessary, and even then, said little. In the records of the Han, her name appears in titles, not in edicts. But her influence was carved in the restraint of her son, in the calmness of his rule, and in the very fact that the Han survived to become great. History often celebrates emperors who conquer. It rarely honors the ones who resist the temptation, and almost never does it remember the women who made that resistance possible. But Boji remembered. She remembered every vanished consort, every poisoned cup, every night spent rehearsing humility. She remembered holding her son's face in the dark, whispering that one day, if they endured, he would sit on a throne of silence and rule a land that no longer fed on blood. And now that he had, she watched him from behind the curtain, not as a ruler, but as a mother who had already won her war. The wind in Dai was sharper than memory. It sliced through silk, crept under walls, and curled around the spines of those unprepared for its truth. This was not the court of Chang'an, where rumors wore perfume and smiles could kill. In Dai, there were no illusions, only hunger, cold, and the unvarnished weight of rule. It was here that Boji disappeared entirely, not into the shadows of palace intrigue, but into the quiet desolation of survival. And it was here that her son became something more than a name in exile. Dai was not a reward. It was a margin of the empire, of relevance, of remembrance. Bordering the lands of the Xiongnu, it was a buffer against chaos, a forgotten wall of humanity stretched thin. Yet for Boji, this place was sanctuary. There were no spies here, no perfumed courtiers to overhear, no concubines angling for favor. Only the vast sky and the silence between footfalls. Here she could raise her son into something the empire did not expect. Liu Heng was still a boy when he arrived, but his eyes held the fatigue of generations. Boji did not weep for his lost status. She had never trusted titles. They were invitations for enemies to sharpen their blades. Instead, she taught him to observe, to listen to the wind before it screamed, to know when to yield and when to vanish. The court they built in Dai was austere by imperial standards. No towering halls, no chorus of scholars, just functional walls, clean rice, and men who knew how to hold a spear. Boji ran the household like a field marshal of virtue. Every coin was tracked, every servant chosen not for lineage but for loyalty and silence. She allowed no luxuries, no indulgences of memory or rank. Liu Heng was a prince only in name. In daily life, he was a governor, a magistrate, a judge of grain weights and stolen livestock. And so he grew, not into an emperor's heir, but into a man hardened by dust and necessity. He learned the law not from scrolls, but from the cries of farmers cheated by tax collectors. He learned diplomacy not through ceremonies, but in delicate meetings with tribal leaders whose trust could not be bought. Boji watched, always just behind him, always careful not to overshadow. She knew the balance. Too much influence and he would be suspected. Too little and he would falter. She gave him space to lead, but never abandoned the helm. The messengers from Chang'an came rarely, and when they did, they brought news more like warnings. Lü Zhi had enthroned a child, one of her grandsons, as emperor. Whispers said he was too young to speak, that she signed decrees in his name with a hand stained in blood. Ministers who opposed her vanished. The last of the emperor's old allies were either executed or pushed into irrelevance. The court was no longer Han, it was Lü in silk. Boji listened to the news with the same face she wore when assessing a spoiled batch of grain. Emotion had no utility here. Only patterns mattered, and the pattern was clear. The more absolute the Empress Dowager's grip became, the more brittle her foundation grew. Years passed. Liu Heng came of age, married a quiet woman who bore his children, and governed with restraint learned not from ideology, but from necessity. The people of Dai grew to trust him, not as a prince, but as a protector. He punished sparingly, taxed lightly, and kept his distance from the corrupt magistrates who still tried to send coin and favors back to the capital. He became known not for ambition, but for fairness. And Boji ensured that reputation traveled. But she also ensured it didn't travel too far. Letters from the capital became more erratic. Lü Zhi's health declined. Her grip on the throne, once iron, began to shake. She died without naming a true successor. What followed was not transition, but vacuum. The Lü clan, emboldened by decades of unchecked power, tried to install their own. Chaos erupted. Some in the court tried to restore old bloodlines. Others whispered of abolishing the monarchy entirely. Armies loyal to different princes marched toward the capital. It was a second founding in everything but name, and in the eye of that storm, the ministers looked outward, for someone clean. Liu Heng had been too far to be tainted by court politics, too restrained to raise alarm, too forgotten to be feared. But now that obscurity became his shield. The ministers believed they could control him, a man who governed without fanfare, raised in the cold north, tempered by hunger. He would be grateful. He would be pliable. He would be a placeholder. They did not know Boji. The summons came by way of a sealed scroll, carried by 3 officials in hastily stitched robes, their horses gasping for breath. Boji read it first, then passed it to her son. The silence in the room thickened. Servants knelt, afraid to even glance upward. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only the low hum of something ancient shifting under their feet. Boji instructed the palace to pack, but slowly. She burned personal letters, destroyed records, and dismissed several long-serving aides whose presence might be questioned in the capital. She knew the court would be watching, even now. The cleaner they arrived, the less suspicion they would draw. Liu Heng hesitated, not from fear of the throne, but from fear of losing the simplicity that had shaped him. He asked his mother, in the privacy of dawn, if it was a mistake to return, if power was a trap disguised as duty. Boji did not answer directly. Instead, she recited a proverb her own mother had once whispered. "You cannot avoid the fire if you are born of the hearth." The journey back to Chang'an was nothing like the one they had taken away. The roads were cleared, soldiers bowed, farmers knelt in frozen fields. The empire had not known peace in years, and now they looked to a prince who had ruled without incident, who had built a name not on ambition, but on the absence of it. When they entered the capital, the contrast was suffocating. The palaces were grander, the people thinner, the walls higher, but the eyes, they were hungrier. Ministers flanked the corridors like hawks in ceremonial robes. The throne room had been cleaned, but not cleansed. The blood of betrayal still lingered beneath the lacquered floors. The coronation was swift. They could not afford instability. Liu Heng was crowned Emperor Wen of Han, and the court exhaled in cautious relief. They believed they had placed a quiet man on the throne, a pliable man, but Boji knew better. Her son bowed only once. After that, he began to rule. His first edicts were not dramatic. They were modest, almost dull. A reduction in court expenses, a ban on extravagant burials, a decree limiting the number of palace musicians. But these were signals, codes only the observant understood. Power, when held by a man who did not want it, became unshakable. The court adjusted. Some ministers tried to manipulate him with flattery. Others tried to bait him with foreign threats. He listened to all, but obeyed none. Boji watched from behind a silk screen, her eyes never blinking. She did not attend court often. She did not speak in public. But her presence was felt, in the restraint of her son, in the simplicity of the court, in the absence of fear that had once defined the Han. And yet danger never disappeared. The Lü clan may have been purged, but their echoes remained. Old allies, resentful generals, forgotten sons of forgotten consorts. Every corridor held potential knives. Boji reminded her son constantly, in letters left on his desk, in quiet nods during private meals. Humility was not weakness, it was protection. One night during the Lantern Festival, Liu Heng walked alone through the gardens. Servants were dismissed, now guards posted at a distance. Boji joined him, her steps slow, her breath visible in the cold. They said nothing for a long time. Finally he asked, "Will they ever trust me?" Boji looked up at the moon. "They don't need to," she said. "They only need to need you." He nodded, and that was the end of it. In the years that followed, Emperor Wen would go on to reshape the empire. But in those first fragile days, when the blood of the Lü was barely dry and the walls still whispered, it was Boji who held the silence together. She had spent her life vanishing for the sake of survival. Now she stayed hidden for the sake of peace, and in that paradox she became immortal. The imperial robes sat uneasily on Liu Heng's shoulders. Their weight was not in the silk, but in the memory of blood. He had not fought for this throne. He had not schemed, nor begged, nor bled. He had simply remained while others destroyed each other in their quest for it. In a world that devoured ambition, survival had become the rarest form of power. And now the survivor was emperor. The palace, reborn under his rule, carried ghosts in its walls. Ministers bowed deeper, but spoke more carefully. The echoes of Lü Zhi's tyranny had not yet faded. They lingered in the corridors, in the faces of old servants who still flinched at sudden footsteps, in the eyes of children who did not yet know how to smile without fear. Liu Heng felt this atmosphere pressing down like fog, heavy and gray, erasing color from ceremony. Peace had been declared, but no one yet knew how to live in it. He began his reign not with proclamations of conquest, but with absence, of cruelty, of extravagance, of arrogance. Taxes were reduced, punishments softened, grand construction projects were halted. The machinery of empire, long addicted to excess, stuttered under his restraint. Some ministers interpreted this as hesitation. Others called it weakness. A few understood the truth, that moderation, in a throne accustomed to domination, was a form of rebellion. Boji remained as she had always been, near the center but never at the center. As Empress Dowager, she was given chambers that rivaled any noble's palace, yet she furnished them with only what was necessary. Her guards were few, her attendants were silent, her presence in court was rare, and when she did appear, she said less than required. But every glance from her son to her, across banquets, councils, ceremonies, spoke volumes. She was no longer hiding, she was anchoring. Still, peace was not a steady thing. The court shifted constantly beneath her son's feet. The ministers had not forgotten the taste of power during the Lü era. The generals resented a ruler who preferred negotiation over glory. The scholars debated whether Confucian ideals could survive without harsh enforcement. And in the harem, the women whispered not of poetry, but of legacy, of sons. Liu Heng had many consorts. Some he had taken before the throne. Others were appointed after, offered as tokens by noble houses, hoping to secure favor. Boji observed them with measured eyes. She remembered the harem under Lü Zhi, a snake pit dressed in silk, where ambition had no boundaries. She did not want to see her son's reign fall into that same trap. But the emperor, now burdened by the crown, began to drift from her reach. He held court longer. He listened more to ministers than to the quiet advice she left in folded notes. He smiled more often, but the smile was strained. His nights grew heavier, his mornings later. His face, once lean from hardship, began to soften, not with decadence, but with weariness. The tension between mother and son was never spoken, but it pulsed between them like an invisible current. Boji felt it in his eyes when he looked at her, not with defiance, but with fatigue. He was ruling gently, but under siege, and the choices before him were becoming sharper. It was succession that reopened the wound. Liu Heng had several sons, but the crown prince was Liu Qi, son of Empress Dou, a woman Boji regarded with cautious neutrality. Empress Du was quiet, intelligent, and outwardly respectful. Yet Boji saw in her the same ambition that had once stained the throne with blood. It was not cruelty that concerned her. It was conviction. Conviction, even in virtue, could be a weapon. As Liu Qi grew, so did his resemblance to his father, not in temperament, but in perception. The ministers began treating him as an emperor in waiting. He attended court sessions, learned the scripts of governance, spoke of reform with the enthusiasm of youth and the certainty of one who had never tasted consequence. Boji watched him carefully, not as a grandmother, but as a strategist watching a storm form over calm water. The emperor, proud of his son, began giving him more responsibility. He delegated hearings, allowed his name to be used in ceremonial decisions. Liu Qi grew more confident. His mother, Empress Dou, began asserting more presence in the palace hierarchy. The once quiet chambers of Boji now found themselves bypassed in protocol. Her seal requested less, her voice consulted less. It was not disrespect, it was succession. Boji felt the distance sharpen. She had never asked for power, and yet now that she was losing what little influence remained, she realized how deeply her identity had become tied to the fragile peace she had helped construct. Her son, once a quiet listener, now ruled with the self-assurance of one who believed moderation was inherent. He had forgotten, perhaps, how it had been carved into him, not by nature, but by necessity. And so she chose once more to recede. She withdrew from court functions entirely, citing health. She returned to a daily rhythm of meditation, reading, and quiet walks in the bamboo groves behind her chambers. Servants were instructed not to mention the names of ministers or concubines in her presence. She surrounded herself only with stillness, but stillness did not bring peace. She began to reflect, sometimes too deeply, on the architecture of her life. Had she raised a cautious son only to have him empower a generation that saw caution as cowardice? Had she protected him from the teeth of court politics only to leave him unarmed against velvet daggers? Was Liu Qi becoming the kind of ruler she had taught her son to avoid? Eloquent, earnest, but blind to the dangers of purity in politics? The inner conflict gnawed at her. She did not fear death. She feared legacy. Then came the matter of the younger prince, Liu Wu, the emperor's favored child from another consort. He was charismatic, beloved by soldiers, generous to a fault. Whispers emerged in the outer court that perhaps he should be the heir, that he, not Liu Qi, had the strength to continue the dynasty. Boji said nothing, but she noticed the change in Liu Heng, his divided affections, his hesitation, his guilt. One night, a private feast was held to celebrate the emperor's health. Only family attended, no ministers, no scribes. Boji sat beside her son, across from Empress Dou, beside the crown prince. It was a rare moment of unity, artificial, orchestrated, but delicate. And in that silence, Boji saw the future. She saw in Liu Qi's sharp eyes the same certainty that had doomed emperors before him. She saw in Empress Du's composed face the seeds of dynasty, calculating, controlled. And she saw in her son a man fraying beneath the weight of a peace he could no longer maintain alone. That night she wrote a letter. It was never sent. It remained in her drawer, tucked beside an old comb and a half-finished poem. In it, she told her son that peace was not inherited. It had to be taught again and again, and that to do so, he must remember who he had been and die. Not a ruler, not a reformer, a survivor. The emperor, now aging more swiftly than the court dared admit, began preparing for the future. He reaffirmed Liu Qi as crown prince. He offered titles to Liu Wu, attempting to balance affection and obligation. The ministers rejoiced. The factions stirred. The palace walls braced for another storm. Bo Ji remained silent, not out of fear, but out of purpose. She had said all she needed to say, and now, like the wind that had shaped them both in Dai, she would let her absence speak the loudest. Her son would face the weight of succession. The court would shift. The heirs would fight their wars, in words, in symbols, perhaps in silence. But none of them would ever fully grasp the quiet architecture that had allowed them to exist at all. Because she had never ruled. She had never commanded. She had only endured. And in that endurance, she had shaped an empire. The court of Han under Emperor Wen had become a palace of restraint. Measured voices, modest processions, ceremonial frugality so precise that it had become a style unto itself. No grand banquets, no imperial parades, no triumphal statues carved into mountain cliffs. The ministers, at first disoriented, had adjusted. The treasury overflowed not from war, but from stability. The people sowed and reaped in peace. The empire, outwardly, was breathing without strain. But beneath that breath, the lungs were tightening. The emperor ruled with calmness, but that calm had become fatigued. The decades of caution, of silent battles against extravagance and arrogance, had drained even his iron will. His reforms, praised by scholars and merchants alike, were beginning to strain under the weight of legacy. For every new field tilled, there was an old noble demanding privilege. For every tax reduced, another lord demanded tribute. The cracks were thin but spreading. And in the heart of the palace, where silk rustled like wind over dry leaves, the true fractures were not among ministers or generals. They were within the family. Crown Prince Lü Zhi had grown tall, proud, and sharp-eyed. His education was impeccable, his manners refined. He spoke the classics with the ease of memorization and the conviction of youth. But Bo Ji saw what the scholars did not, a hardness forming beneath that elegance. He had learned to imitate restraint, but not to feel it. He treated humility as performance, simplicity as optics. His blood bore the mark of her son, but his spirit, she feared, bore the fingerprints of the court she had spent her life trying to erase. He began pushing, not with rebellion but with insistence. He wanted more say in court affairs. He began reshaping the minor councils under his control, placing his own tutors and allies in subtle positions of influence. He criticized quietly some of the emperor's reluctance to modernize military forces or expand trade relations with restive border territories. He called for more roads, more embassies, more legacies. Bo Ji watched with eyes that had not dulled. She had lived through enough courts to recognize ambition dressed as duty. She had seen it in Lü Zhi, in the fallen consorts of Liu Bang, and now in the boy who would someday sit on the throne her silence had preserved. It was not treason. It was something more dangerous, the belief that inheritance justified impatience. But it was not only Lü Zhi. In the inner court, whispers began circulating about the emperor's lingering favoritism for another son, Liu Wu, the Prince of Liang. A boy born of warmth and laughter, adored by the people for his generosity, his boldness, his charm. He rode through provincial towns without an escort. He hosted poetry contests and athletic games. Soldiers loved him. Merchants adored him. Even commoners found themselves murmuring, if only the empire could be ruled with such joy. The court heard those whispers, and so did Bo Ji. The emperor, now older and increasingly weary, began inviting Liu Wu more often to the palace. It was innocent enough, a father missing his child. But appearances in court were never innocent. Lü Zhi saw the invitations as signals. Empress Du, his mother, saw them as warnings. Bo Ji saw them as inevitabilities. The dynasty had survived annihilation. It had survived tyranny. But could it survive succession? One evening, the court gathered for a seasonal ritual of thanks, an ancient Confucian rite honoring the cycles of nature, stability of harvest, and the virtue of ancestors. The emperor led the ceremony. The crown prince stood beside him. Liu Wu, unusually, was granted the honor of carrying one of the ancestral tablets, normally reserved for the heir. The chamber was silent. No one spoke. But the weight of that gesture pressed like a boulder upon the room. Bo Ji sat at the rear, in her elevated seat as Empress Dowager, watching the ritual unfold not as pageantry, but as prophecy. Afterward, ministers whispered, Allies were tallied, lines were quietly drawn. The emperor, exhausted from ceremony and age, retired early. Lü Zhi did not. He remained behind, speaking with key ministers longer than protocol required. His words were not treasonous, but they left echoes. Empress Dao, once content to remain behind veils and silks, began appearing more often at political receptions, offering subtle guidance on court procedure, inheritance law, and the importance of continuity. Boji withdrew. She retreated into the deepest parts of the palace gardens, resuming her walks alone. She began refusing visits from ministers, from ladies-in-waiting, even from her own descendants. Her servants brought her news, but she asked for less. Not because she did not care, but because she saw the storm on the horizon, and she had no illusions of stopping it. She began writing again, not for policy, but for memory. In hidden scrolls, she recorded not events, but instincts, moments. The way Liu Heng had clenched his jaw when ministers flattered him, the way Liu Qi had paused too long before bowing, the way Liu Wu smiled with charm that covered a craving for admiration. She wrote not for historians, but for conscience. One morning, a message arrived that Liu Qi had met with border generals, ostensibly to learn about troop logistics. It was permitted. It was expected. But it was early. Too early. Boji saw the pattern, the crown prince testing boundaries, assessing loyalties, not to rebel, but to prepare. The memory of Lü Zhi burned like a ghost in her mind. Not in action, but in inevitability. Power attracted gravity. It could not be paused. It could only be directed. She sent a single note to the emperor. It contained no warning, no accusation, just a phrase he would understand. The roots are heavy. Guard the trunk. The emperor did not respond. Instead, he summoned both sons privately in the weeks that followed. The content of their meetings was never recorded, but afterward, Liu Qi became quieter. Liu Wu traveled less, and the emperor aged faster. In public, the family remained unified. They appeared together at festivals, sat beside one another during ancestral rites, even shared tables at intimate banquets, carefully arranged so no one appeared too distant nor too close. But unity, Boji knew, could be staged. The heart of the dynasty no longer beat with shared purpose. It pulsed with anticipation. The court of restraint had begun to fracture not with rebellion, but with succession, not with treason, but with transition. And Boji, who had spent a lifetime building silence into strength, realized that the silence would not outlive her. She began ordering her affairs. She called for no architects, no masons. Her tomb, she declared, was to be modest. No statues, no shrines. She declined the offer of a separate mausoleum beside her sons. "I will lie near him," she instructed, "but not in marble." The servants wept. She did not. In her final weeks of court presence, she appeared once more in the audience chamber. She said nothing, but every official stood taller. Every attendant trembled. She needed no words. She was the memory of survival made flesh, and survival, she knew, was no longer enough. Her son had led the empire through restraint. Now he would have to lead it through division. And when he could no longer lead, the sons she had watched grow into men would shape the future. She could not stop them. She could only disappear once more and pray that her absence would leave behind enough shape to guide them. Time had softened the empire's edges, but in its core, the shadows remained. Boji, now in the twilight of her influence, could feel them stirring again. Echoes of the woman who had once ruled through fear and silence, whose reign had carved bloodlines from stone and left scars in the rituals of governance. Lü Zhi was dead, but her specter remained. Her name was no longer spoken in official records. Her portraits had been removed from ancestral halls, her decrees overwritten, her family extinguished in one swift, decisive purge. But history does not vanish with erasure. It breathes through people, policies, and paranoia. And now, in the thinned air of imperial halls, Boji sensed the return of that suffocating chill. It began quietly, as such things always do. A minor magistrate in the southern provinces was found to have once served under a known ally of Lü Zhi. A historian uncovered correspondence that suggested a network of surviving supporters scattered across lesser posts in the administration. It was not rebellion, it was not sedition, but it was history with a pulse, and that made it dangerous. The court predictably divided. Some ministers demanded immediate purges. Names were whispered in corners, old affiliations re-examined, temple offerings scrutinized for hidden symbols. Others, more cautious, advised restraint. Emperor Wen listened. He always listened. But this time, his silence was not serenity. It was uncertainty. For Bo Ji, it was not fear that returned, but memory. She had lived through Lü Zhi's rise. She had watched noble women disappear overnight, their children reduced to orphans of scandal. She had seen the architecture of tyranny built not with swords, but with paper, ink, and silence. And she had survived by erasing herself from that architecture. But now, as the court began turning inward once more, looking for enemies in the fabric of its own robes, Bo Ji felt a pull she had long buried. The pull to speak. She had not spoken of Lü Zhi in decades. Not to her son, not to the historians, not even in her private writings. To name the Empress Dowager of Death was to summon the specter again. But when a petition crossed the emperor's desk recommending the posthumous desecration of Lü Zhi's tomb, Bo Ji intervened. She did not write a protest. She did not call for an audience. She simply appeared. The emperor was holding court when she entered, unexpected, unsummoned. Her robes were simple. Her hair, now snow-white, was bound in the old style. The chamber fell to silence. Even the rustling of paper stopped. She walked slowly, not from frailty, but from gravity, and she sat. She did not address the court. She did not address her son. But her presence, after so long, was itself a decree. The petition was withdrawn the next day. No one spoke of Lü Zhi again, at least not in ink, but Bo Ji had made her point. Justice must not become vengeance dressed in ceremonial language. Later that week, she requested a visit to the inner prison, a place reserved for those whose crimes required discretion rather than spectacle. It was not protocol, but she had once lived among those forgotten women, and she needed to see the remnants for herself. She was escorted by silence. The guards did not meet her eyes. The hall smelled of earth and iron. The inmates, mostly former officials or their widows, offered no cries for mercy. They had learned that sound invited punishment. She walked past cell after cell until she found the one she had come for. A man, frail, hunched, hands stained with ink rather than blood. A former scribe of Lü Zhi's Treasury Bureau, arrested for continuing to use outdated formats in official ledgers. He was not a rebel. He was a relic. She looked at him, and in his eyes saw no ideology, only confusion. He was a man who had outlived his own usefulness, whose crime was memory. And in that instant, Bo Ji felt something crack beneath the surface of her survival. Had she done the same? Had her silence, her strategy of disappearance, preserved a son but abandoned others to the machinery she chose not to resist? Had she, by refusing to challenge Lü Zhi, by choosing safety over solidarity, allowed that architecture of fear to deepen? She said nothing to the man. She stayed only a moment. But when she left, the question followed her like a shadow she could no longer shake. Back in the palace, Emperor Wen convened a closed council. He sought advice on how to proceed, not with vengeance, but with stability. The court teetered between past and future. If they reopened wounds, the empire could bleed again. If they ignored the ghosts, they might rise stronger. Bo Ji sent no letter this time. She made no appearance. But that evening, she sat with her son in private, over a quiet meal with no servants, no courtiers. It was their first conversation in months. And though no historians recorded it, that night changed the course of justice in Han. The emperor, guided by his mother's example, chose mercy, but not amnesia. Former allies of Lü Zhi were reviewed case by case. Many were released, some were reassigned. A few, whose guilt could not be denied, were quietly exiled rather than executed. The court murmured. The ministers bristled. But no one opposed him openly, because the people remembered something more powerful than fear. They remembered peace. And Bo Ji, now returned to her solitude, allowed herself one brief indulgence, a prayer. Not to gods or ancestors, but to memory itself. that it might forget her omissions, that it might forgive her calculations, that it might in time understand that in a world of knives and crowns, survival was not cowardice. It was a different kind of courage. Outside her window, spring returned. The plum blossoms bloomed late that year, but bright, and as their scent filled the air, Boji closed her eyes and whispered the name she had never dared speak aloud. Lü Zhi, not as a curse, as a warning. It began with a cough, not loud, not constant, just a quiet rasp at the edge of speech, a hesitation between breaths, a stiffness in the way Emperor Wen gripped his robes when he rose from the throne. No one acknowledged it at first. The ministers ignored it. The scribes omitted it. The healers, summoned in secret, used words like fatigue and seasonal imbalance. But Boji knew better. She had watched too many bodies decline under the weight of titles. Her son was dying, not in a single collapse, not in any dramatic public fainting, but in the slow unraveling known only to those who had once held him as a child. His voice lost its force. His steps lost their confidence. His appetite waned. And most telling of all, his silences grew longer, not contemplative, but uncertain. The court responded in its usual choreography, with overcompensation. Banquets were planned, ceremonies were extended, the emperor's public appearances were choreographed for maximum visibility. Rumors were crushed before they could reach the gates. But none of it fooled Boji. She could see the change in his eyes. He was preparing to let go. What unsettled her most was not the inevitability of death, but the indecision that preceded it. The matter of succession, seemingly resolved years ago, now trembled again in the undercurrent of the court. Crown Prince Lü Zhi, though confirmed and appointed, had not earned the full loyalty of the empire. His manner remained cold, his words too calculated, his ambition too exposed. He was everything her son had avoided becoming, and everything the court had learned to expect. Liu Wu, the favored younger son, still commanded affection far beyond his station. Whispers returned, of reshuffling inheritance, of dual authority, of dividing the empire into spheres of governance to appease both heirs. Dangerous ideas drawn from precedent, dressed in the language of reform. Boji saw the pattern repeating, this time not from a tyrant's hand, but from a father's heart. The emperor loved both his sons, and in his final days that love became a burden. He began requesting Liu Wu more frequently, even as his body weakened. He held court less often, choosing instead to meet with close advisors in private, sometimes for hours, sometimes not at all. Reports from the border slowed, proclamations were delayed. The empire paused, waiting for clarity, while the silence lengthened. Boji did not wait. She summoned Liu Zhi, privately, without ceremony, without witness. It was the first time she had done so since he was a boy. He arrived with practiced humility, bowing low, his expression carved in porcelain. But behind his eyes, Boji saw something she could not quite define. Not cruelty, not fear, something harder, entitlement. She studied him for a long moment, and he, unnerved, looked away. She did not lecture, she did not threaten. She simply reminded him of the garden in Dai, where she and his father had once tended silence like a crop. She spoke of survival not as conquest, but as inheritance. She told him the people did not want brilliance. They wanted breathing room. And she ended with a warning, not of rebellion, but of memory. If he ruled with arrogance, they would not rebel, but they would forget him. And that, she said, was the deepest exile. He left without responding. That night, the emperor collapsed. He was carried to his chambers, and for the first time in his reign, the imperial physician was summoned without secrecy. The court learned what it had suspected. The emperor had only days. The gates of the palace tightened. No ministers were admitted without summons, no messages left without seal. Boji did not leave his side. She sat by his bed through the nights, adjusting his blankets with the same hands that had once swaddled him as a newborn. He could barely speak, but in his eyes there was still lucidity. He knew she was there, and he knew what she had done, not just for him, but for the throne. When he slept, she watched the flickering of the lantern. When he woke, she offered warm water with crushed dates. When he drifted between, she whispered verses from the Book of Songs, gentle, rhythmic, ancestral. Not for comfort, for continuity. He died at dawn. No last words, no declarations. Just the breath of a man who had ruled through restraint, leaving in the same silence he had once inherited. The court mourned. The banners turned black. The bells tolled through every province. But the true mourning took place in the stillness of Boji's chambers, where no tears were shed, only memories replayed like whispers across stone. She did not collapse. She did not cry. She composed herself, arranged her robe, and prepared to bury a son she had kept alive, not just through danger, but through history itself. The funeral was a paradox, grand in scope, humble in execution. As per his request, the emperor's tomb was modest, his rites abbreviated, his name inscribed not with conquest, but with virtue. Boji ensured every detail was honored. And when the final stone was set, and the last incense burned, she turned away, not from grief, but from the empire itself. She declined the court's invitation to serve as regent. She rejected titles offered in her honor. She returned to the innermost quarters of the palace, surrounded only by a handful of aging attendants, and closed the doors to the world. She had crowned a son, and now she had buried him. The dynasty would continue, Lü Zhi would reign, ministers would shift, wars would one day return, peace would fragment, history would move on. But Boji had nothing left to prove. She had survived to see the dream fulfilled, and the cost counted. The drums of mourning faded quickly. In the days following Emperor Wen's burial, the court wasted no time reassembling itself. Ministers repositioned, seals were reissued. The throne room was swept clean, as if grief were a form of dust. Crown Prince Lü Zhi ascended as Emperor Jing with the mechanical fluidity of a plan long rehearsed. The ceremonies were flawless. The banners hung at precise angles. The people bowed as if on cue. But within the palatial chambers, something more profound shifted, something colder. The empire no longer had use for silence. Boji, once Empress Dowager to the most restrained monarch in Han history, was now a relic of a fading ideology. Her presence, once grounding, now seemed unnecessary. No one said this aloud. No decree was issued, but the gestures spoke with clarity. Invitations ceased. Consultations dried up. The messengers stopped arriving. Even her food was delivered by younger servants who barely recognized the weight of her name. She did not protest. She had not expected to be needed. That was never her purpose. But the stillness felt different now. It no longer protected her. It erased her. In the early weeks of Lü Zhi's reign, reforms were introduced swiftly. Some were extensions of his father's policies, modest tax adjustments, reassignment of regional duties, but others carried a sharper edge. The punishments became firmer. The military budget expanded. Courtiers who had long bided their time returned with ambitious plans for territorial assertions and stronger central authority. The era of restraint had ended. Boji observed in silence. From the shaded courtyards of her isolated residence, she read the edicts with the same calm she once reserved for poetry. She read between the lines, tracing not just the words, but the momentum behind them. The new emperor did not dismantle his father's legacy, but he repainted it. He made it sharper, louder, more suited to the expectations of history. And history, she knew, was impatient. She walked less. The bamboo grove she once frequented grew wilder, the path less worn. She spoke little, even to her most trusted attendants. Her reflections, once recorded in neat lines of brush and ink, now appeared only in her mind. Unwritten, ephemeral, drifting between memory and regret. One morning she received a gift from the new empress, a carved ivory comb, ornate and shimmering with gemstones. It was an object of courtesy, not affection, a symbol, not a gesture. Boji held it for a moment, then returned it to its box. She had no use for decoration. Her chamber grew quieter. Fewer visitors came. Even those who served her began whispering about her irrelevance, not with cruelty, but with the bluntness of youth. They admired the new empress, the fresh energy of the court, the confidence in Emperor Jing's voice. They had not lived through fire. They did not recognize what silence had built. And that more than anything told Boji her time had truly passed. She did not fear death. She feared that those who inherited the empire would confuse peace with inheritance, that they would treat stability not as a choice but as a birthright. She feared that history would forget how close the Han had come to implosion, and how it had been rescued not by a conqueror, but by restraint. But fear no longer moved her. She requested no audience with her grandson. She wrote no warnings. She simply remained. In those final years, she found clarity not in legacy, but in stillness. She understood that survival had been her language, and like all languages, it would be lost when no one needed to speak it. She made her peace with that. But before the end, she did one last thing. She summoned the chief palace scribe, not for edict, not for memoir, but for a request. She asked that when she died, there would be no grand rites, no banners, no public mourning. Her tomb would be beside her son's as promised, but unmarked save for a single inscription. She endured. The scribe hesitated, unsure whether such simplicity was proper. But Boji looked at him, and he understood. This was not humility, it was defiance. She lived quietly, she ruled never. But she endured when empires nearly broke. And in that endurance, she shaped more than a reign. She shaped the possibility of continuity. The end came not with mourning, but with silence. Boji's passing was announced in a single line of court record. The Empress Dowager, mother of Emperor Wen, passed peacefully in her chambers. No funeral banners lined the walls. No ceremonial drums echoed through the capital. Her body was wrapped in cloth, not gold. Her name was not inscribed in jade. She was buried beside her son, as she had requested, close but unmarked save for one word carved into stone by a single mason's hand. Endured. Most in the court did not notice her absence. Some assumed she had died long ago. Others remembered her only as a distant, silent figure behind a curtain of incense and protocol. A few whispered her name with vague reverence, unsure why they did so. And yet without her the palace felt less anchored. There were no shifts in policy, no great changes in ceremony. The empire continued its daily rhythm, efficient and predictable. But in the marble halls of the Han court, halls she had once walked unseen, there lingered a peculiar kind of echo. Not of footsteps, not of commands, but of choices not made. Boji had ruled nothing. She had never signed a law. She had never led an army, nor raised her voice in court, nor worn the dragon-embroidered robe of supreme power. She had faded behind veils, chosen absence over appearance, yielded even when she knew she was right. To most, she had been a shadow, a footnote, a survivor, and yet what she built endured longer than most emperors' conquests. For what is an empire, if not its memory of how not to die? Boji had chosen silence when others chose fury. She had hidden when others had postured. She had protected a child not with armies, but with anonymity. And through that, she had kept the bloodline alive when the throne had become a graveyard. Her son had learned peace not from ideology, but from watching his mother survive it. Her grandson inherited not just land, but the illusion that it had always been stable. That was her paradox. She gave them everything, by leaving them nothing to fear. The historians struggled with her legacy. She had no scandals, no declarations, no monuments. Her influence was not measured in events, but in the lack of catastrophe. In the pause between upheavals, in the fact that after the storm of Lü Zhi, the Han did not collapse, but instead stood quietly on the shoulders of a woman who had refused to be noticed. Years passed. Emperors rose and fell. The dynasty grew and fractured, grew again. The name of Boji was mentioned less with each generation until it vanished from the common tongue entirely. But in the architecture of restraint, in every policy of clemency, every law carved in moderation, every hesitation before war, there remained the ghost of her choices. Sometimes late at night, in the archives of forgotten scholars, her name still flickers like a candle in wind. They debate. Was she wise or merely lucky? Was her silence strategy or fear? Was she mother or regent, passive or profound? They missed the point. She was necessary, not to be praised, not to be remembered, but to have existed exactly when she did. Because without Bo Ji, the boy who became Emperor Wen would have died before his name meant anything. The dynasty would have eaten itself from within, and all that would have been left of Han would be a cautionary tale. Instead, it became an era. And in that era, beneath the glory, beneath the titles, beneath the thrones, lay a woman who never raised a voice, never sought a crown, never wrote her own history. She simply endured. And in doing so, wrote everyone else's.